Well, if they want to be back in that position, at least for a chance to change things around, obviously free agency and the way that they team build from a front office perspective in the coming weeks will be paramount. And that leads us to the second snippet from Jeremy Fowler's latest on that ESPN feature that was released last night. And in this case, I would love to get your thought on this too, because, and maybe we'll discuss it on the back end, but I'll let you digest the question before I play it. And that is this: do you feel that this is opinion based content from Jeremy, or is it a mixture of opinion and also reporting based on conversations that he's had in the building? We'll answer that after this.
The defense could use at least one playmaker, particularly in the secondary, which struggled early in the season. The offense needs a vertical receiving threat to complement Zay Flowers, and re-signing left tackle Ronnie Stanley is a priority. Regardless, Baltimore is positioned to capitalize on Jackson's prime with an overdue breakthrough.
So the quote, as you see on the screen, the defense could use at least one playmaker, particularly in the secondary. The offense needs a vertical receiving threat to complement Zay Flowers. And re-signing left tackle Ronnie Stanley is a priority. How would you answer that question that I posed a second ago?
I took it as reporting, and I know we split it apart with his first segment because it fit with the whole idea of like, are the Ravens playing too tight and what they're doing in January. But when he said that he had, people in the building swear this, and then he kind of transitioned into what they need. And Jeremy Fowler has always been a reporter, not necessarily an opinion guy. And when they put that package together, it seemed to me that he had done some reporting. So I could be wrong, but that was certainly my impression. And I also keep that impression because I think he's right. I don't think he's making this up. So
I would agree with your interpretation, by the way.
Okay. So we're on the same page there. So let's kind of break this down. Let's do this. Let's first hone in on this Ronnie Stanley part in offensive line. So he said, and we'll go with that first because he specifically said signing left tackle Ronnie Stanley is a priority. That fits in really well with what Mina said on her show about what the Ravens need to do with their the left side of their offensive line with Ronnie Stanley and Patrick McCary, who are both unrestricted free agents. Mina is sending a message. I don't know if they need the message or if they've already gotten it, but here is a message to the Ravens about that offensive line in order to protect Lamar Jackson.
Chance the Ravens are similar to the Chiefs. I think there's a good chance that they get priced out of the Ronnie Stanley market. I am not sure that's a great decision, though. If both him and because you got McCary also, who was guard, leaving, that's a little bit more change on the offensive line that I'm comfortable with for them. I think the Ravens should bring back one of Stanley or McCary. I don't like the idea of like them just saying, hey, we've got Lamar. It's going to be fine.
This fan base is going to appreciate the last part of that quote right there. But I think the Ravens should bring back one of Ronnie Stanley or Patrick McCary is the first part of that. And then she goes on to say, I don't like the idea of them just saying, hey, we got Lamar. It's going to be fine. And Sarah, let me just add this in as well, because it was a long segment and I did a little bit of editing to clean it up for the show.
Okay.
Within that same piece, within that same topic, Mina went on to acknowledge that after she started to look at a few of the left tackle needy teams, if you will, she did acknowledge that there isn't a whole lot of like, quote, obvious destinations as she maybe thought of at the beginning part of that clip, and went on to say that maybe, just maybe, Baltimore could get a reasonable market for Ronnie. So just wanted to add that in there. But clearly we want to focus in on the end of this quote, which is obviously refreshing and also pressing.
Well, just to be, if you could clarify for me, when you said there's no obvious destinations, you mean she's saying there's no obvious suitors for Ronnie Stanley?
Fit-wise, as she's looking around the league, teams that are left tackle needy, she would at the beginning, she's like, oh, there's going to be a market. And Kevin Clark, her co-host for this episode, was like, oh, he's, they both agreed he's going to price himself out of Baltimore. And then the segment continued, and she started like thinking out loud, like Kevin mentioned the New England Patriots as a possible destination. Okay. And they went back and forth on that. So the long story short is she went from saying those comments to oh, you know what? There aren't as many obvious destinations that would be a good fit for Ronnie, not necessarily the interest portion of it. Does that clear that up?
Yep. Well, it makes me want to go listen to some more of why they took out other teams, because to me, it's like who isn't looking for? Kansas City Chiefs.
Yeah, Trey is expected to leave in free agency. Exactly. So that's the team that's going to be floating around.
Stanley protecting Patrick Mahomes when he could be protecting Lamar Jackson. Like, to me, if what Fowler is saying is indeed a report, and Ronnie Stanley is a priority, then you go about this in the opposite way that you are doing it with Brandon Stevens, which Eric DeCosta said, we're gonna let Brandon go check out the market. Okay. I do not want, if you are serious about re-signing Ronnie Stanley, you do not let him sniff the market. You don't do it.
Yep.
And I don't know where Ronnie's head is at. I would love to interview him, even though he's not going to tell us. But I'm curious where his head's at when he took a pay cut, not a restructure, not an extension, a pay cut, and lost, and just let them have millions of dollars. And he needed to, because he was coming off of those injuries. He had no market. There wasn't going to be a market for him. He knew it was like a do or die year. And then he came in, he stayed healthy all 18 games, also 18 weeks, 17 games. And he had a comeback year. He was definitely the comeback player of the Ravens, and nobody would ever give it to an offensive lineman, but I would think he'd be in the running if they actually considered offensive linemen across the league. And so I'm curious where he is, where he's like, remember all those millions I gave back to you?
Yeah.
And he, by the way, he almost made it back, because if he had made a Pro Bowl, it would have been the incentives to get it back. And he did eventually go to the Pro Bowl, but as a backup. Yep. And the incentive specifically was that you had to be first team, Pro Bowler, not an alternate. So I'm curious if he's like, no, I got to go out and recoup the money I lost and realize that I did have a big major payday, but I could have another one. And this is for sure going to be my last one. And so, or is he thinking, I have unfinished business with Lamar Jackson, who I've been protecting my entire career, and we are so close. Like, I don't know, but he could be close if he hit the market and went and signed with Kansas City Chiefs. Like,
oh, he might be closer.
Yeah.
He could dang well be closer, Sarah, couldn't he? I hate to say it, but history unfortunately begs the question on that one.
And let's look at this. Let me share my screen here real quick from Spot Rack. So they have him. Let me see if I can zoom in here a little bit. There we go. Their market value for Ronnie is $20.7 million average annual.
Yep. So
they're saying 2 years, $41 million. Ooh. I mean, he's not cheap. Left tackles aren't cheap, but to Mina's point, it's Lamar Jackson. He's your franchise. And do you really want to take the risk of seeing if Roger Rosengarten can move to the left? So then you're like, it's an unknown. You feel pretty good based off of what he did his rookie year and how quickly he acclimated to the NFL. But then in his second year, you're asking him to move over to left tackle, and then you still have an unknown at right tackle. So now you have an unknown at both tackle positions if you move him over, and who knows who's going to take over that right tackle spot. And you don't know who your left guard is going to be.
Right. Instead of being like, hey, we know in our heart of hearts that Roger is going to be our left tackle of the future. But why should the future start now if we feel really good about a couple more years with Ronnie? We still feel like we're in this Super Bowl window right now. We want Roger to continue building his confidence up and stabilizing the right-hand side of the line. We'll go draft another guard, like we hope
or Voorhees, one of those two likely, right?
Oh, well, I think both can happen, right? Voorhees can start day one and they'll still probably draft the guard for depth.
Yeah.
Because Ben's not coming back. You can't expect that to happen.
Ben is not coming back.
Especially not in recent days.
Even before recent days, he was not coming back. But
for
yeah.
sure, that was the icing on the cake, if you will. But so I guess that really becomes the question, how bad. And you're right, Ronnie's as buttoned up as anybody. I would love to know where his mind is, because those two scenarios that you played out, it's got to be one of the two. Gotta
right. And by the way, if you don't pay this to him, okay, well then you've got a very cheap left tackle in Roger Rosengarten, because he's a second round tackle.
Yeah.
So he'll be very cheap. But then are you going to pay for a right tackle? And how much are you going to pay for that? And so this is a predicament. It actually brought me a little bit of peace that Fowler, and again, it felt like he was reporting it, and I could be wrong. But if he indeed was talking to somebody in the building and they said Ronnie Stanley's a priority, that actually brought me, because I just don't see a better scenario than Ronnie and Roger as the two bookends that's available to the Ravens. Like to expect the Ravens to draft another right tackle and just have him come in right away. I mean, it's possible. Maybe you could do that with your first round pick. But generally speaking, that like what Roger just did is very rare. Very rare to find a starting tackle in the late second round. That is rare.
Yeah. You'd be taking the gamble too if you went and shifted Roger to left tackle, of course, for reasons that we've already discussed with that transition. Now people do forget that, remember, he was the blindside protector of Michael Penix at Washington. Michael is a left-hand throwing quarterback. So while he was playing right tackle, he was serving obviously left tackle duties, if you will. And then prior to that, both at earlier in the college in his career and then in high school, as we learned from Tyler Columbus, the former Denver Bronco, who came on our show after Roger was drafted last year. He had plenty of experience at left tackle. But where I'm going with the gamble is, sure, you're gambling on Roger, even though you feel confident in him in the future at left tackle.
But you'd also be before, gambling, like you said.
Right. But you'd also be taking a gamble on what, like you said, whether it be through the draft or you go and find a Morgan Moses-esque free agency signing, as you did a few years ago, to serve as right tackle for the next couple of years. And while Morgan was more than serviceable towards the end, he was starting to drop off availability wise for you. So he ended up going to New York, and I believe he's actually, ironically, I believe Morgan's is set to hit free agency and the Jets aren't bringing him back. So that's another scenario. I'm not talking about Morgan. I'm talking about a similar player.
Right. I know what you're saying. Yeah. So this kind of brings us, Bobby. So yesterday at the very end of the show, we saw Dan Graziano report that the new projected cap would be between $277.5 million to $281.5 million, which is about $5 to $9 million more than what we've kind of been working with as a projection from Brian McFarland. Now, with that extra money, it's certainly good news. And as Ken McCusick pointed out, who's like a data analyst king, right? He's just all about the numbers. He says that new projected cap benefits teams with minimal salary cap space.
Yeah.
And that makes sense, right? Like if we were to give $100 to an adult with a job, it certainly means something. But if I gave it to my 7-year-old daughter, it's like, holy moly, I'm rich, right? Like it makes a big difference when you're going from like 0 to 100. Not as big of a deal if you're like, I don't know, say like you make $50,000 a year, $100 is awesome. But if you're a millionaire and you get $100, it's like, oh, that's nice. Yeah. But whatever, you know what I mean? Yep. And so it's certainly everybody will get the extra money, but the teams that are tightest against the cap, it's obviously the most beneficial. So as Ken goes on to say, he says at the midpoint of the range, the Ravens have approximately 10 million. So let's actually get into, let's go to Brian McFarland, who updated his salary cap summary based on these new projections. So he put in the middle range, which is what he did before. So if the range is 277 to 281, he's now saying, okay, let's estimate that it's 279.5. Okay. And with that, he now says the Ravens are they have 12.7 million in cap space. And before it was just under $6 million. So it's almost doubled. Okay, so that's a big deal. That will help the Ravens. We're talking about Ronnie Stanley. We're talking about McCary. We're talking about all the needs. That will help. However, you don't want to get too far ahead of yourself. So Brian says there are a lot of other factors that are still to come, even though the Ravens have $2.7 million. He said they still have to put in their incentives adjustments. So based off of all the guys that hit their incentives last year, like Kyle Van Noy, remember he was doing that money dance after he hit his sacks incentive. Okay. He said, so the Ravens, that already takes up almost $3 million. Almost $3 million of the 13 you have here. So now you're back down to 10. Then he says you have to tender Ardarius Washington. You're going to have to use a second round tender. That's going to be $5.3 million. So now you're back down to $5 million. He says the rule of 51, I'm not going to explain that. Rule of 51 offset of $1.68 million when Stanley and Aguilar's deals void, if not re-signed before cap, because they had void years. He said that will all, just those three things, Bobby. We haven't even gotten to the draft picks.
Yeah.
The 11-man draft class, which may end up being 10 or 9 or who knows what they do. He says that will already eat up most of the cap space. Like just those three things. It's back down to zero. Now, if you didn't have that extra $6 million, you'd still have to find that somewhere. So at least it takes care of those things and you can start from scratch again. The moral of the story is it certainly helps, but is it going to get you the $20 million a year for Ronnie Stanley? No. And it's going to be hard to backload some of that because Lamar Jackson's contract is already backloaded. We know it's going to be $75 million over the next 2 years. And so the Ravens are still going to find themselves in a crunch, and they're still going to have to make big moves, which we talked about yesterday. Extend Lamar Jackson and or trade Mark Andrews. And then you got all those other extensions, which will get you $3 million here, $4 million there, $5 million there. But it's the significant cap space is within Lamar and Mark Andrews.
Extensions, or part ways with 89. Goodness gracious.